This recording is just going to go over the last couple of slides that are tacked on at the end of chapter 2. So we're going to talk about scientific literature and a little bit about the publishing process, but also how you should be approaching reading scientific literature, not necessarily useful for this class, but that might become useful in future classes within psychology, but also a little bit outside of psych as well. So let's cover the very basics here. We'll start by talking about 3 broad categories of journal articles. The first are our empirical journal articles, or primary studies, or primary sources, I guess is another term. And these are studies that have been reported for the first time. So if I conduct research and I have my experiment and I want to write that up and share it with the world, my publication would be an empirical journal article. And if you wanted to cite one of those sources, that is a primary source because you are directly reporting some research that someone has conducted. The name for that will kind of sink in a little bit when we talk about our next option, which are review journal articles. And these are secondary sources. And these are basically articles that have gone in, read a whole bunch of primary sources, and summarized them all together. So they took a whole bunch of different published studies, and they looked for patterns and trends within a particular area. So I've mentioned before that I do research with songbirds. We look at communication and categorization. So there are journal articles that might look at not just black-capped chickadees and their categorizations, but maybe they look at songbirds in general. So they can talk about papers from corvids, as well as our chickadees, as well as, say, I guess blue jays are still corvids, but anything that falls under the category of songbirds. So there'd probably be a lot of finch work, because those tend to be a model species, but we could take all of those different studies on similar topics in communication and summarize them together in a review article where they have reviewed the literature for some particular field. So that can be really, really useful if you want to know what kind of research has been done. So maybe you want to start doing some research of your own. Maybe you're starting an honors project or going into grad school and wanting to do your own master's or PhD. A review article gives you sort of that starting point. It is then recommended that you'd look at some of the articles that they've reported in the review and maybe go and read those in their entirety. Go back and read that primary source if it's relevant to what you'd be studying. So these are sort of a back and forth process. You might care about the empirical studies, but you can also use review articles to get to them. And then similar, but sort of in their own category, this is where we run into our meta-analyses. So these are articles that not just look at other studies that have been conducted to make sort of broad conclusions, but here it's actually a statistical approach. So a meta-analysis means that they are going to reanalyze the data that's been reported in a whole bunch of published studies. So they'll get a bunch of data sets from existing research, combine them, and then make sort of broader statements. And we've mentioned in some other places that having a larger sample size can be beneficial for your statistics. And so by pulling from multiple different sources, you have multiple samples that you can condense to give you those outputs. So we get our statistics conducted on a new, larger data pool. Obviously, there are limitations. You have to check sort of which studies are they looking at, where did they draw their samples, did all of the studies use similar methods, and things like that. But if you read through a meta-analysis, they actually describe what they were considering, what some of the limitations are, and so on and so forth. So this can be a really good combination of both a review of the field, but also a description of some larger trends in terms of statistical data as well within that field. So all of these can be useful depending on what your purposes are. And of course, if we're talking about all of these different types of research and all of these types of papers, how do you actually get access to them? It really depends on your preference. I've heard a lot of people like PsycInfo. It's a database search engine combined, and it is specific for psychology articles. This is something that's maintained by the American Psychological Association, but it's not necessarily my preference, and it's probably just because I never started using that one. I started using mainly Google Scholar. So you might use PsycInfo, you might use Google Scholar, you might use a combination of them. I like Google Scholar because you can search for whatever. It doesn't just limit you to psychology papers. You can sort of search whatever you want. You might even go through the university's page. So universities will all have their own library site where you can search their database of what the library has access to. I find that while the library site gives you access sort of behind paywalls for a lot of things, because the university has subscriptions for them all, it doesn't necessarily give you a good way of finding those articles. It just means that the search engine is a little bit clunky. So what I'll typically do is I'll use Google Scholar to start, and if an article is behind a paywall, I will then use that article that I found, I'll take the title, and I'll copy and paste it into the library site. And then, if the university has access to it, then it'll pop up with access. So you can kind of use a combination of the two. But as per usual, this is one of those, try them all out and see what your preference is, just to see what works best with you. And over here, I had borrowed from my, this is from my methods course. We were looking at some of the different tips that they have for when you're searching for a particular topic. And this is sometimes helpful because we will find very quickly that psychology uses a lot of different terms for the same concept. I ran into this problem while trying to find articles on play in non-human animal species for one of my seminar courses. But the term play has different meanings in different areas. And some areas would prefer to use a completely different term entirely when looking at play behaviors in non-human animal species. So you might have to start looking into what are some other terms that are used for this concept. You might also look at what are closely related concepts that might get you there as well. You might find that you prefer this author and their lab tends to do research in this area. So instead of a topic, I'm going to search for that researcher, and so on and so forth. So these are just a couple of tips that might be useful in searches when you need to do them. And then when you're reading the article, I always find that we're taught extensively in high school science classes about our abstract and introduction, methods, results, and conclusions, but we don't necessarily know how that translates to scientific articles, and specifically in how you pull information from those. I have a lot of people who recommend reading the abstract and saying, aha, that's going to tell you everything you need to know about this study. And in response to that, it actually depends. Yes, the abstract is a summary of the article. It does give you a vague idea of what the article's about, but it is such a short blurb that it doesn't necessarily tell you everything. Sometimes, if you want things explained in more clarity, you're almost better off just reading the introduction all the way through. It is more reading, however, it'll usually tell you what they know already, what they don't know and would like to fill in, and then the method that they would like to use to fill that gap. So they'll actually go in and clearly state what the topic is, some of their theories, some of the background of what's typically done in their field, and then what their goals are in this current study, and sometimes even how they plan to carry it out. So if the abstract doesn't necessarily mean anything to you, there's no harm in reading the introduction as well. Then we get into our methods and our results. The methods are as advertised, basically telling us how they conducted the study. This will also include information on their participants, how they selected their sample, the materials they used, their procedures, any apparatuses they're using. All of those things are included in the methods. In a standard reading of a paper, especially if you're using it to, say, support an argument in maybe an essay, the methods section is something you can almost always skip. And that's because this gives you the how-to instructions if you wanted to, say, replicate the study, or the specific details on the number of participants that they had, or the specific survey that they used. But in most cases, you don't need that level of detail, and the methods tends to be very clunky and dense in terms of technicalities. So it's probably a lot better to skip that section and only return if you need more detail than is provided elsewhere. Similarly, I'd say pretty much the same for the results. The results are going to describe what statistical tests they ran and what outcomes or conclusions they've drawn from them. And that can be useful. That's where you get all of your, there is a significant difference between this group and that group type statements. However, it's presented in statistical language. So they'll tell you that this kind of analysis was run with these kind of factors, and we got this p-value and that f-value and these confidence intervals, but none of that is necessarily all that useful to you. Instead, you might find it more beneficial to skip all the way to the discussion, where they're going to summarize the study. They'll reiterate what they did. They will then also summarize the results and tell you what it means. So that telling you what those results mean might make a lot more sense to a reader who doesn't care so much about the specific methods or the specific statistics. And this is what I find is a common issue when I have students reading papers, or when I used to read papers. You get bogged down in the methods and the results because they are so dense and so technical. But you can understand most of the article as long as you read the introduction and the discussion. So keeping that in mind for future classes. The discussion is also a great place where they might propose things like alternative explanations for the results that they got, or limitations of the study, things that they'd like to try in the future, or things that went wrong. So it's a really good place to look for some of those critical thinking aspects. And some papers will have just a discussion, some will have discussion and conclusion. There's different combinations depending on which journal they publish in, but they're all going to do about the same. And then the last point that is fairly easy to skip over is our list of references. However, if you are, say, doing research to answer a specific question, or you are writing an essay, you might want more sources that relate to the one that you've just finished reading. So if there was a statement somewhere in your readings, especially in that introduction or discussion, where there was a citation after that statement, maybe they connected their results to someone else who found similar results but in a different species, you can actually follow that reference to that other article. And then you can go off and read a different article that's similar to this one. So you can use the references to find all the sources that they cited. So it can be a good place to look and find other sources that you could use when conducting research. Just some things that you might not have been aware of or might not have thought about when reading a scientific article. So very, very useful to know some of that information. Once again, not necessarily applicable for this particular course, but it can be useful in the future, so I figured I'd share what I know.